Ooh, it snowed again. Okay, anything I have to work on? Nothing I like. Okay. You guys are about to just like. I think date was date in stores. That was a news thing we used to do. You can feel it on the streets, and there's a lot of dates know who I am just because I've spoken. I've been a fairly public figure here, and even just over the course of the day, I've been stopped on the streets by the average Danes, by two policemen stopped me today, so thanked me for what I've been doing and speaking out, but also what's going on, what's happening to the United States. Don't you understand that there's so much on the line here? It is profound, and as someone who has spent a lot of time, obviously, all throughout Europe, but in particular here, I've never had a trip that's felt like this, and I was here just a couple of months ago.
Well, the president is now threatening these new tariffs, as we've been reporting. How much pressure does that put on these European countries, and how much damage could it do to their economies?
Well, I think it's this. The weird part is, I think we are at a time in this crisis, and I do call it a crisis, that we're beyond thinking through just the short-term economic impact of any particular tariff that the White House might threaten, put on tomorrow, take off the next day. I think that's just less of a concern for the individual European countries and even the EU as a whole. What I think is considerably more of a concern for these European leaders, for NATO as an institution, as an alliance, is where we go from here. And that might mean making some tough choices. And that might mean, say, retaliatory tariffs. That might mean the bazooka that Macron talked about a couple of days ago. So my point is that, yes, I think that they might suffer, but they are willing, in my mind, most of the Europeans I know are willing to take that risk considering what's on the line.
Well, Ambassador, you mentioned the NATO alliance, and President Trump just this morning told NBC News no comment on whether the U.S. would seize Greenland by force. Now, if he were to do that, and of course the idea sounded so far-fetched not that long ago, if he were to do that, what would the implications be? Could the U.S. be at war with NATO?
Well, that's the thing. And this alliance, which let's not forget what this alliance is. This alliance is hands down the most successful alliance the modern world has ever seen. It's been an extraordinary deterrent. We've never seen the only times that Article 5 of NATO has been invoked, which is when an enemy of NATO attacking a NATO ally. was after 9/11 when the United States invoked Article 5 and the entire alliance came to our defense. I think it is hard to see how this alliance survives any sort of hostile takeover of Greenland, whether that is militarily or some other coercive action. It is hard to see that, largely because NATO is an alliance that is built on this kind of idea of mutual trust and respect, and this idea that our national security is in line with the national security of the entire alliance. And this threat from the Trump administration undermines kind of exactly what NATO is as an institution, as an alliance, as an organization. So it's hard to see how it survives.
And Ambassador, just this morning we learned that President Trump has tied this fight to the Nobel Peace Prize and suggesting that he's no longer obligated to think purely of peace. Now, is that something world leaders should take seriously or literally?
Well, it's an extraordinary statement, Gabe, and I think that this is where we are in my mind. Look, Greenland says they're not for sale. Denmark says that Greenland's not for sale. The EU says Greenland's not for sale. NATO says the Greenland is not for sale. 70+% of Americans don't want to acquire Greenland either by force or by purchase. At what point is this in American national security interests versus the interests of one man? Because we can't articulate anymore a national security argument that holds water. So it is very hard in my mind to see where we go from here, considering just the sheer absurdity of things like the letter you just referenced.
Well, you mentioned this at the beginning of our conversation. People were stopping on the street, even today. Well, we did see members of Congress travel to Denmark to try and reassure members of Parliament there. But do their words carry any weight, especially at a time when we see the president increasingly flex his power on the world stage?
Yeah, I think the answer is that it matters. It matters a tremendous amount. And my friends here, and I have spoken, in full disclosure, I was speaking with the delegation both before the trip and I've spoken with them after the trip. The trip was extraordinarily well received. I think even more so because it was bipartisan and you had Tillis and Murkowski on the trip. Do I wish it had happened a year ago when the president was making these threats against Greenland? Yes. It came way too late as far as I'm concerned, but I'm glad it happened, and it was extremely well received from the Danes. That being said, we need to put some teeth behind some of the words that are being said by these senators, meaning bills do need to be passed in the House and Senate to avoid what I think would be this just extraordinary conflict that I believe that will make all Americans weaker, and it only serve to empower our adversaries in Russia and China because of the weakening of NATO.
Well, former Ambassador Rufus Gifford, we thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure.
And coming up, Minnesota on edge. The Pentagon prepares combat troops.
Minnesota. Soda.
Potential deployment to the Twin Cities to quash anti-ICE protests as the Justice Department opens a criminal investigation into state and local officials. Plus, President Trump says it's time for new leadership in Tehran, as human rights groups now report nearly 4,000 people have died amid the anti-government protests in Iran. We have the response and the latest fallout. You're watching Meet the Press now. Stay with us.
Was that's for today's date.
And welcome back. We're following breaking news out of Minnesota as defense officials tell NBC News the Pentagon has ordered 1,500 combat troops to prepare to deploy to Minneapolis in response to anti-ICE protests. News coming as sources tell NBC News the FBI is asking agents to voluntarily travel to the Twin Cities for temporary assignments. Anti-ICE demonstrations, meanwhile, show no signs of letting up. And the Justice Department is now vowing to investigate protesters who disrupted a service yesterday at a church where they believed a top ICE official serves as a pastor. Officials familiar with the matter also tell NBC News that the DOJ is investigating whether Minnesota Governor Tim Walz and Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey conspired to impede federal immigration agents. Governor Walz calling the administration's actions a dangerous authoritarian tactic, and the mayor denying any wrongdoing on Meet the Press yesterday.
And obviously, it would be deeply concerning if the federal government is targeting someone for a product that is quite literally my job. It is my responsibility to speak on behalf of Minneapolis residents. It's my responsibility to do everything possible to keep our city safe. And so while I haven't received a subpoena or anything else at this point, this should be deeply concerning, not just for Minneapolis, but for anybody out there. I mean, this is stuff that happens in other countries. It shouldn't happen in America.
NBC News correspondent Maggie Vespa is in Minneapolis, where, by the way, it is dangerously cold outside right now, so she's thankfully indoors for us. And with me on set is retired Colonel Steve Warren, whose more than 3-decade career with the U.S. Army included roles leading the Army's global communications efforts. He is now an NBC News military analyst. Maggie, I want to start with you. You just talked to an activist who protested at that church service yesterday, meaning she is now presumably under investigation, right? So what'd she say?
Yeah, as far as she knows, she's under investigation, Gabe, just based on the broader statements that we've seen. But she said she hasn't been contacted by the DOJ or anybody within the Trump administration to confirm that. So she's leaning on the reports. Right now, she says she doesn't regret anything. If we bring up that video, her name is Nakima Armstrong. She's in the crowd who was at City's Church yesterday. It's a local Christian church here in St. Paul, so the Minneapolis area. And she says the group went there to confront a man named David Easterwood. He's a pastor at that church, and protesters allege he also runs the local ICE field office here. Now, I should point out, we've reached out to Easterwood, no response. DHS also declining, there's that video, to confirm that position that protesters say he has within ICE, saying, in their words, they would never dox an ICE officer or employee. So we have this protest, and now we have the threat of this criminal investigation by the DOJ. Armstrong sticking to the mission at hand, saying that she's furious with ICE's tactics on the ground. She's furious at the Trump administration, and she's not scared of this investigation. Here's part of what she told me, Gabe.
They have turned Minnesota, and particularly the Twin Cities, into a place that is under siege. It feels like a military occupation at times, and at times it really is. I mean, the amount of violence that has been perpetuated by ICE agents against everyday, ordinary residents of the Twin Cities is absolutely unconscionable and outrageous.
Now, I mentioned that statement from DHS. I want to read you another part of what they said about this protest in particular, telling us, quote, agitators aren't just targeting our officers. Now they're targeting churches, too. They go on to say, we won't be deterred. ICE isn't going anywhere. So, Gabe, just another example of how these protests are kind of narrowing and shifting on the ground as these tensions just continue to mount here in Minneapolis.
You know, and Maggie, about that troop deployment, we're talking 1,500 active duty soldiers who've been ordered to prepare to deploy. So we've also learned that the FBI is asking agents across the country to voluntarily go to Minneapolis, as we mentioned. Give us an idea of how big the federal presence on the ground is there and how big it would be if this all comes to fruition. That the Minneapolis Police Department, as I understand it, is just a few hundred officers, right?
It's 600. That's a great point to make. So right now we have about 3,000 federal officers. We talk about ICE, Border Patrol, and just other DHS departments on the ground. So Minneapolis PD is already far dwarfed by the amount of federal officers that we have here, by this federal footprint. Then you talk about, let's add potentially 1,500 active duty soldiers, 2 battalions from the 11th Airborne Division, if this comes to fruition. And we should point out, defense officials stress, just because these soldiers are kind of being readied, it doesn't mean that anything's been decided. It doesn't mean that this potential that the president has floated of invoking the Insurrection Act here in Minneapolis is indeed coming to fruition. They call this, in their words, prudent planning, but that would be about 4,500 if this does happen. And then we have these FBI agents as well, and we're being told by 2 sources with knowledge of the matter that agents across the country have been asked to voluntarily take temporary positions here in Minneapolis. One source telling NBC News that the kinds of jobs they would do here on the ground are investigating people, for instance, who are accused of assaulting federal officers, ICE officers included, investigating instances of potential theft or vandalism from FBI or federal officers' cars. We have no indication as to how big that swell of FBI officers are, but we're talking, again, well above 4,000 if this were to happen. Again, compared to Minneapolis PD, it's a great point, about 600 officers. So this was already historic when the Trump administration first sent in 2,000 ICE officers. It's ballooned since then. It could balloon again, Gabe. It's huge.
Maggie, you've asked about live for us in Minneapolis, where, again, it is dangerously cold. Thank you to you and your team for the reporting, and stay warm. It is well below 0-degree wind chill, as I understand it. Thanks, Maggie. Colonel Steve Warren here with me on set. Colonel, so many questions here. You just heard Maggie talking about the potential for these active duty troops, which would dwarf the size of the Minneapolis Police Department. What would these troops do if they are deployed to Minnesota? What role would they play?
Sure, there are many possible roles. The last time, Gabe, that U.S. troops were deployed to an American city under the Insurrection Act was 1992 during the Rodney King riots. U.S. troops were then used to prevent looting, to help calm the masses, to help quiet down the rioting that was going on. So it was a very clear mission. And by the way, it was very, very successful. In this case, we haven't seen looting, to my knowledge. We haven't seen a lot of out-and-out rioting, sort of the targeted destruction of property that we saw back then. So what I think you would end up having to see is perhaps the U.S. military being used to create space between the federal agents who are conducting their duties and the protesters who are not happy with it.
And you heard Maggie reference the Insurrection Act. The president hasn't said whether he would invoke it. If it were to be invoked, would those troops need to adhere to U.S. law, domestic law, military law? How would that work?
Yeah, that's right. They're under military law. The U.S. law, military law, the law of land warfare, all of these things can be confusing. Ultimately, U.S. soldiers conducting U.S. military missions are subject to what we call the Uniform Code of Military Justice. It looks very much like regular U.S. law, but it's enforced by military commanders. The Army has its own, the military has its own prison system. It has all of this. So if any soldiers were to violate law, they would be punished or they would face justice through the Uniform Code of Military Justice.
And are these troops trained to patrol U.S. cities?
Well, that's an important question. These forces, U.S. war fighters, are probably the best trained and most disciplined forces you'll see anywhere. But there's a very good reason we call them war fighters, right? When we train these troops, we use words like lethality, violence of action, close with and destroy the enemy. This is what these forces are trained to do. They're also, I think it's important for folks to know, they're a very young force, right? Your average infantry platoon, which is who would most likely be on the ground, is probably 18, 24 years old. That's the average age, led by a 23, 24-year-old lieutenant. So they're well trained, but focused on force.
So there are a lot of hypotheticals here, admittingly, but Minnesota Governor Tim Walz, he has said that he would potentially deploy the Minnesota National Guard to help maintain peace. Is there some situation here where you'd have the the National Guard troops and the active duty troops? Could they be squaring off against one another?
I'm going to go out on a limb and I'll put a reputation at stake. Absolutely not. That will not happen. It's the worst possible nightmare scenario. It will not happen.
Actually, I'm being told we're out of time here, but Colonel Steve Warren, thank you so much for your expertise. We really appreciate you being here as we try and sort out all the different possibilities here in Minneapolis. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
And up next, the price of peace. Tensions ramp up between Washington and Tehran in the aftermath of Iran's deadly protests amid new reporting on President Trump's plans to charge nations $1 billion for a permanent spot on his so-called board of peace in the Middle East. Stay with us. You're watching Meet the Press Now. Welcome back. President Trump is calling for new leadership in Iran, telling Politico that Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, is, quote, a sick man who should run his country properly and stop killing people. It comes as the Ayatollah claimed, quote, the Iranian nation has defeated America in a public address and accused the U.S. of being behind the demonstration, though he offered no concrete evidence of that. Those protests appear to have slowed, and state media reports Iran's president has called for internet restrictions to be lifted. This all comes as the Iranian regime, for the first time, is acknowledging a death toll in the thousands from the demonstrations. And after President Trump appeared to walk back threats of U.S. military action against Iran last week, claiming the killing of protesters had suddenly stopped. The Human Rights Activist News Agency, a U.S.-based activist group, says the death toll is still rising, with more than 3,900 people dead, the vast majority protesters. The group says it independently verifies each death. And joining me now is NBC News Chief International Correspondent Keir Simmons. Keir, thank you so much for being here. What is the reality on the ground in Iran? Have protests really died down there for good?
Well, pretty much. I mean, the protests have been crushed. There are reports of some protests still in some parts of Iran, but not to the extent that we saw 10 days ago. I mean, it was 10 days ago on around about the 8th that the internet was shut down. Effectively, the whole country went dark. And then, according to these reports and the pictures we've been seeing, the regime sent in large numbers of security forces who opened fire on protesters. They talk about direct fire from snipers, machine guns, deliberate killing. These numbers of dead and because of the internet blackout, Gabe, it's been difficult to get a full picture. These numbers of dead, even now, still rising, and may be the biggest numbers of killed since the revolution in 1979.
And Keir, as we noted, President Trump said it is time for new leadership in Iran. Is there any sense the U.S. is really willing to pursue regime change?
Well, that's the question. The Iranian regime itself, the president, for example, just today, is warning the United States not to target Ayatollah Khamenei, the leader of Iran, the 86-year-old who gave a sermon just on Friday after President Trump had decided to put attacks on pause, military action on pause, gave a sermon calling President Trump a war criminal. So just through the weekend, we've seen the rhetoric ratchet up between both sides. And the USS Abraham Lincoln, the aircraft carrier, a carrier strike group, is on its way to the region now. It was in the Malacca Straits, the Malacca Straits last time I looked, on its way from the South China Sea. So that will give President Trump the capability, crucially, to target Iran and also defend Israel and America's partners and allies in this region if Iran chooses to retaliate. Now, what those attacks look like, whether they involve targeting the supreme leader himself, that is a question. But again, the Iranian regime itself is warning America not to do that. And that is clearly, therefore, something that is worrying them in Tehran.
And Keir, before you go, I do want to ask you about another conflict in the Middle East, in Gaza. We're getting some insight with regards to the Board of Peace that was part of the president's 20-point plan and the more than 20 countries that have been invited to join. What's been the international reaction to that?
Well, I mean, some surprise in some parts of the world, because some of those invited to join the board of peace include President Putin, for example. A number of Arab states and Middle Eastern states also invited to have a representative, including Turkey, for example, and that has infuriated Prime Minister Netanyahu's, the Prime Minister of Israel's government, and it has said openly that it is not happy. So a controversial start for the Board of Peace, but it hasn't even begun its work. But certainly you can say a wide range of representation for that Board of Peace decided by the Trump administration.
Keir Simmons, our chief international correspondent, thank you for following all of those stories for us, Keir. And after the break, we'll take a look at how America is marking Martin Luther King Jr. Day as the life and legacy of one of the most influential civil rights icons in U.S. history lives on. This fraught moment in American history. Keep it right here. Meet the Press Now.
Whoa.
Welcome back. Across the country, Americans are celebrating Martin Luther King Day with parades, church services, and festivals. Here in Washington, a wreath-laying ceremony was held at the Martin Luther King Memorial on the National Mall. Since 1983, Americans have marked the third Monday in January as MLK Day, honoring Dr. King's life and legacy as a leader in the civil rights movement, where he used nonviolent protests to call for an end to racial segregation and was instrumental in the passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. In the midst of a crackdown on immigration by the Trump administration, a number of today's observances have referenced the recent killing of Renee Good by an ICE agent in Minneapolis. Here's Bernice King, the daughter of MLK, at the Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta, where Dr. King once preached.
That story forces us to confront a painful truth. Goodness itself is in danger. And that's why nonviolence is not optional. Nonviolence protects good. It restores good. It multiplies good. Nonviolence is how we guard the good, grow the good, and refuse to let the world normalize the killing of good in our streets, in our systems, in our speech, and in our spirits.
And still to come, President Trump is about to officially mark 1 year into his second term, and voters are making it clear where they stand on his results so far. The panel's next. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. As the polls tell it, a year into his second term, President Trump is having a rough time with voters. His net approval across a slew of recent polls is underwater by double digits. And the plurality of Americans say he's focused on the wrong priorities, according to a new AP poll. But Donald Trump's actions appear to reflect a president unbound from political norms or approval ratings on the world stage and here at home. Joining me now is our panel. Daniela Diaz, politics reporter for Notice. Aaron Rosencrantz, Democratic strategist and CEO of New Blue Interactive, and Stephen Hayes, CEO and editor of The Dispatch and an NBC News contributor. Thank you all so much for joining me here on the panel. Daniela, I want to start with you. President Trump started his term, not really being beholden to polling. At least that's what he says, depending on the issue. Are we seeing him act in that sort of way that he just doesn't really care about polling right now? And so him watching the polls that we've been looking at, 86% of Americans not wanting him to take Greenland by force. Does his administration care at all about that?
It's clear they don't.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, Americans have been saying for the last year that they want the president and his administration to focus on what's happening in the United States. Mm-hmm. They elected him for his America First agenda. And what we're seeing is that he continues to travel more and across seas rather than worry about what's happening here in the United States. You can really tell I cover Congress, as we all know, when I talk to battleground district Republicans and they're saying, look, it's great that the president is focusing on foreign affairs, but people here do not have money for rent, money to put gas in their cars, and we're going to focus on those pocketbook issues to try to win back our seats, because that's what our constituents care about, and that's why you're seeing these Republicans break from the president, because they say, we know what we care about.
But Stephen, are enough Republicans doing that? Is that pushback really significant? And do you think more Republicans might make this Greenland issue, for example, a red line?
I mean, I would hope, as a longtime conservative, I would hope that that's the case, because what we're talking about is crazy. I mean, this text message that the president said today, where he said, in fact, I'm not thinking about peace anymore because I didn't get the Nobel Peace Prize. It was the kind of thing, when I first read it, I thought it was a parody for 10 minutes, and I kept looking and looking. Is this real? Is it real? And it turns out that it's real. So the president is going to avoid peace because he didn't get a prize. You would think this would be the kind of thing that Republicans would speak out against. We have had times like this in the past, issues like this in the past, when Republicans have spoken out. But I would say the record is not great here. I mean, the people who are most willing to speak out are people like Representative Don Bacon, who's leaving Congress, and Tom Tillis, who's retiring at the end of his term. They've spoken out. They've been rather forceful. It's certainly the case that a lot of other Republicans don't understand why the president is talking about Greenland, why he's leaving open the possibility of taking Greenland by force. And then you have a whole different group of Republicans who are, in effect, getting the president's back on this. And Ted Cruz gave an interview over the weekend saying Greenland is absolutely crucial. You've seen Eric Schmidt, senator from Missouri, doing the same thing. So they want to be in the president's good graces, so they support him regardless.
Well, look, the president, a couple of weeks ago, he told our colleague, Christian Welker, that MAGA is me. Do you think that extends to America first? And no matter what he says, his base will go along?
Yeah, when you were talking to Daniela, that was one thing I was thinking is, in the past, the president has been willing to defy what polls would suggest that he do to remain popular, and he can turn substantial numbers in that Republican base in his favor. So, yes, he campaigned on a more sort of neo-isolationist, non-interventionist foreign policy, but the MAGA base, they're with him if he wants to hit Iran, they're with him on Greenland, they're with him on Venezuela. You know, this is true of healthcare. They were opposed to the president they favored the president when he said that he was going to restrict healthcare and limit the government's involvement in healthcare. And then when he seems to turn tail and say that he favored it, they were for him then too.
You know, Taryn, come November, is this really going to matter for Democrats? I mean, Democrats, you heard him over the weekend saying, oh, this is a land grab and, slamming the president on this particular issue. But do voters really care when it comes to foreign policy, for these midterms, or will it be the domestic economy?
I think they're really going to care about the economy. I mean, that question that plagues everyone every day of their life is if I'm better off. And I just don't think that, I think you actually make a really great point that he's got a really very loyal base that follows him wherever he goes, but that means he's not on the ballot. So are they going to follow him to the ballot box? Probably not. And that means that the people that are going to the ballot box are pretty angry because they feel like they can't afford things. They feel like their health care is being taken away. So maybe it won't matter what he's doing overseas, but I think it's going to have an impact on the midterms.
Danielle, let's take a big picture look at this. Tomorrow, I guess it'll be 1 year since this administration. So much has happened. It's felt like, several years. But taking a big picture look at this, the things that the president promised during the campaign trail, one of the things he promised, although he hedged a little bit, was this issue of retribution on the campaign trail. Is that a promise that he has kept?
Absolutely. We've seen him use the Department of Justice for his own, to further his own benefit, investigating his own political rivals. And he's been frustrated sometimes when they don't go far enough or the justice system does not actually vote in his favor. It's going to be an issue, I think, as we get closer to 2026, the fact that he's weaponized the Department of Justice. We've seen lawmakers call out on both sides. We saw Republican senators call out for what he did, or he says he has nothing to do with, but the subpoenas against Fed Chair Jerome Powell, his own party was speaking out against it. It's become an issue that these things continue, and he's getting criticism for it.
Well, the White House would come back and say, oh, it's not retribution, it's accountability.
Right.
But, Stephen, look, it's easy to play that game, what if the other side did this? But at the same time, could you imagine if you subbed the name Trump for Biden and, Minnesota for, say, Texas, if Democrats were in power? What would happen?
Yeah, I mean, I think you'd find everybody on every side of these issues sort of flipped on the other side. I mean, Republicans would say, and I think it's not entirely true, and in some cases it's really not true, but in some cases it is true that what Trump is doing is retribution for the ways in which he was attacked by the justice system. I mean, I thought on the Georgia case, I thought on January 6th questions, he deserved, I thought on the classified documents, he deserved to be scrutinized, he deserved to be charged. But the New York case was always a real long shot. I think that was the weaponization of government, of the judicial system. And Republicans would say, well, look, what Trump is doing now is just payback for that. I don't find that argument persuasive, and even if I did, it wouldn't be the right thing to do. But it doesn't come out of nowhere.
Right. Well, Taryn, there is a portion of the Democratic Party that says Democrats need to show they're willing to fight more. But what does that look like when the president and his administration, they seem to relish it? They welcome that because then it allows them to push back even harder. So what are Democrats to do?
I think what Democrats should be focused on, which I think a lot of them are at this point, is that, we've got to fight for what we can do for the American people. And we need to be able to work around him in some ways, and I think it's like fighting back against him seems to be fruitless in a lot of ways. So they're trying to figure out what they can do and make that impactful as they can. So I think you're seeing a little bit more of that, of how they're going about doing things and what they're saying, because it can't just be like, speaking ill of him or trying to, get him riled up, because it's just walking right into his.
But do Democrats have the message discipline to be able to do that?
Well, I think it's always been a big tent party, and I think you're going to see different responses, but I think it's because across the country, you need different responses right now. Like what people need in their home districts, particularly if you're talking about Congress, is going to be different depending upon what state you are. I don't think we need to have a disciplined message. The mayor of New York City is very different than some Democrat that is being represented in other parts of the country, and we need to be and know that how we're speaking and what we're doing and fighting for the American people is going to be different.
I think we are running low on time here, but thank you all so much for joining me. Daniela, Taryn, Stephen, really appreciate your time on this holiday Monday. And thank you all at home for watching. I'm Gabe Gutierrez, and we're back tomorrow with more Meet the Press Now. There is more news right ahead on NBC News Now. Stay tuned.
We are coming on the air with this deep freeze affecting 1 in 4 of us. Icy highways turning dangerous. And yes, it is winter. It is cold. It's snowing in Florida cold. Our team's out in it with a look at where it's the worst and when it'll warm up. Also new tonight, President Trump telling our team he has not ruled out taking Greenland by force if he has to. What else he's saying in a new text to Norway about why losing the Nobel Peace Prize means he no longer has to think purely of peace. Plus, how one British newspaper made Prince Harry, in his words, paranoid beyond belief. Our team is outside court on those new accusations. Then why the hometown team in tonight's national championship game may hear some boo birds in the stadium. We're live in Miami for the Hoosiers, the Hurricanes, and the booming business of college football. And the latest battle brewing in the beer wars as companies try to fight for a shrinking slice of drinkers. Why one brand's bringing back an iconic figure tonight that we find interesting, the most interesting in the world. It's coming up later in the show. Hey there, I'm Hallie, and tonight I'm cold, you're probably cold. 40 million of us from the Northeast to the Midwest and down to Florida are cold. And this Arctic blast is getting dangerous. Look at this. Dude. We know several people have been hurt after this huge pile. Dude's really putting on the new cars in Michigan. They've got cleanup crews even now trying to get this thing all cleared up. And it's just a mess with all those semi-trucks back to back to back. Some of them are blocking the whole highway. You see this one trailer, it's like, looks to be basically split in half entirely there. A lot of this is happening because drivers couldn't see the roads. Why? Because of this. Can you see? I mean, it's a whiteout, basically. It's almost impossible to have any visibility. And even down in Florida, there's snow trickling down. There it is, coming down on the state line sign there at the Panhandle. And even with temperatures 10 to 25 degrees below average in some spots right now, I want to be real. It is winter. It is cold. This is not record-breaking cold. It's colder than normal, but it's not bonkers, at least not yet. That comes in a few days, and that is what has experts so concerned about what we're feeling now. We're going to get into that with Bill Cairns in a second. But first, I want to bring in Aaron McLaughlin in New York City, where they are getting ready for it. Aaron, give us a sense of what people should be expecting.
Well, people here in New York City, Hallie, can expect temperatures to plunge yet again. A very chilly 5-degree wind chill in the forecast for tomorrow. Speaking to emergency officials here in the city, they said that two things at this point concern them most: the idea that the power could potentially go out in one of these major skyscrapers where people live, and then they'd have to rehouse all of those people. So that's nightmare scenario number one for city officials. Nightmare scenario number two, potential fire. Lots of emergency officials, actually, that I've been talking to across the Northeast say they are very concerned specifically about space heaters, warning folks that if you're using a space heater to stay warm, do not use an extension cord. Make sure you plug it directly into the wall, and make sure that you have a perimeter around said space heater. A concern shared with emergency officials I was speaking to over in Wisconsin. And spare a thought, really, for anyone in the Midwest right now. They're in Wisconsin. They're bracing for wind chills of minus 40 with 40-mile-per-hour winds. I was speaking to Milwaukee's chief health policy official, and he was telling me that in the hospitals they've seen an uptick in the number of patients being admitted to the hospital with cold-related injuries. He said he's extremely concerned about folks spending too much time outside, specifically more than 10 minutes, he said, in those conditions can lead to hypothermia. It has officials extremely concerned.
Aaron McLaughlin live for us in New York. Obviously, a lot of concern out there. Aaron, thank you. And Bill, that is only going to increase as the week goes along, because right now, while it is frigid, it is in some ways, to mix metaphors, only the calm before the storm.
Yeah, we're going to get 2 Arctic outbreaks, and then possibly the biggest winter storm we've had in years moving across the southern half of the country in areas that don't get a lot of snow and ice, maybe even paralyzing in some areas as we head to this upcoming weekend. So that's going to have a lot of people changing their plans. We'll fine-tune it as the week goes on. So right now, this is the primer. The cold air is here. It's been brutal all day long. International Falls, Minneapolis, Chicago, Marquette, negative wind chill values. And this is what's going to be arriving tonight into tomorrow in areas of the Northeast. We do have, cold advisories. The higher levels, cold warnings. That's when you get, you warn people about being outside with exposed skin. This is more to the annoying, and if your car breaks down or something, then it could be problematic. This is tomorrow, by the way. D.C., lowest wind chill 9. New York around 4. Northern New England around 0. Still in the negative numbers up and through the Great Lakes. As far as the southern storm goes, this doesn't begin until Friday, so we have a couple days to watch this. On this map, the blue shows you the snow, the pink will be the ice. So we're talking areas of Texas, Louisiana, Arkansas, northern Mississippi, northern Alabama, northern Georgia, maybe Atlanta, all in possible icy conditions, and then a heavy batch of snow. Right now I'm watching you closely: Little Rock, Memphis, Nashville, Lexington, Charlotte to Raleigh, Richmond, D.C., possibly Baltimore. The northern edge of it is kind of like New York City and Boston. As of now, the favorite area for the heaviest stuff would be to the south. So here's kind of that whole map combined for you for where we think the best chance of snow is, the best chance of ice, and this will have significant impacts and travel problems right into the weekend. So the best chance for that heavy snow, there you are, Hallie, D.C. to Raleigh, Nashville to Little Rock to Oklahoma City. But this isn't until Saturday for the most part.
Okay.
We have numerous days to see if this shifts north or south, but these southern areas, this could be the biggest snowstorm in maybe a couple of years for many locations.
Well, and you know how bad ice can get when ice starts to go through it, even a little bit of it, especially for folks who aren't used to it, don't have the equipment there so easily. If there is at least any silver lining, it's the Northern Lights silver lining, right? Because we could maybe, even here in the Mid-Atlantic, even across the Midwest, some people could see it that don't typically get to see it.
Yeah, this could be the story of the night. I mean, right now in Europe, the Northern Lights are on fire. I mean, you can go to any webcams on any ski resorts or glaciers, and it just looks incredible out there. And they're being reported in England too. So this is at the mid-latitudes. This is like in areas of Germany. I'm seeing it in Austria. And the reason that's important, this isn't just like Norway and Finland and Iceland. This is further to the south. So as soon as our sun is setting now and we get dark enough, if you have clear skies from the Carolinas through Missouri, Colorado, northwards, you may have an incredible show. This could actually be close to what we saw about a year and a half ago. This is all from a huge solar storm that started yesterday when the sun exploded, had a big flare. It arrived at 2 o'clock this afternoon. this could be a really incredible show. If it's on your bucket list, Hallie, tonight is the night.
All right, Bill Cairns, good advice. Thank you so much, as always. Also tonight, the whole Greenland thing is escalating in this kind of dramatic way. Because, you know, President Trump wants Greenland. He wants to own it, or he wants to take it. And in a new phone interview with NBC News, he's not ruling out taking Greenland by force, i.e. using the military. But he also might buy it. He's been saying he's concerned about Arctic security. He thinks Greenland's important, so the U.S. needs it for that reason. We've got Russia moving stuff around up there, China, etc. Okay, so it's security. But also maybe it has to do with the Nobel Peace Prize. That's what the president's texting the Norwegians now, saying since they didn't give him the Nobel, he doesn't have to think purely of peace, but for what is, quote, good and proper for America. The implication being that what's good and proper is, as the president puts it, the U.S. having complete and total control of Greenland. Now, the Europeans are at like a level 10 on this. They're going to maybe unload a trade bazooka, their words, after the president said he'd throw tariffs on some of their countries if they didn't go along with this. And even though he wants Greenland, Greenland doesn't want him. That's been clear from some of the protests over the last couple of days. And the Greenlandic MAGA message, make America go away. Our Ryan Nobles over in Denmark speaking to some folks there.
We feel frightened, and especially the people living in Greenland, both adults but also youngsters and kids.
The children are worried, the adults are not sleeping. Greenland is not for sale, so what is on the table from the U.S. side right now is not interesting for us, and you can't buy a country.
Brian Chung is covering all things tariff-related, but I want to start with Garrett Haake at the White House. Okay, Garrett, so when it comes to Arctic security, put a little pin in that. We'll come back to it. But when it comes to Arctic security, Denmark, the Europeans have said they will work with President Trump to give him what he wants on that. So why would the president spend the estimated $700 billion it would cost to buy Greenland or the military muscle? Why would he spend that to get something that the U.S. could have for free?
Yeah, it's a weird case of where the president seeming to not want to take yes for an answer, Hallie. The Danes and the Greenlandic people have basically said we can have what we need in terms of establishing security, but the country stays theirs. I think there are a couple of things at play here. It is possible that what we're seeing is kind of a page out of Art of the Deal, an attempt to drive down a price that the Danes say doesn't exist, that our research says could go as high as $700 million, to get it to something a little bit lower, something that we could potentially actually spend. It's not like the United States has $700 billion lying around in the couch cushions for a purchase like this. I think there's also a certain element of legacy building that we sometimes see in a president's second term. You've seen that with the president and his travel schedule so far. You've seen it in the manner in which he approaches the Western Hemisphere as kind of United States backyard that needs to be protected and controlled by the United States at all costs, and his desire to do, as he has said publicly, to protect it better by owning it than you would by leasing it. This seems to be very much stuck in his mind, as the only way to guarantee American security in Greenland is to make it part of America. All of that is speculative at this point. We can go by what the White House has said, which, including today, is that it's not about the Nobel Peace Prize. Here's what Scott Bessent had to say in Davos when he was asked about that.
I don't know anything about the president's letter to Norway, and I think it's complete canard that the president will be doing this because of the Nobel Prize. The president is looking at Greenland as a strategic asset for the United States. We are not going to outsource our hemispheric security to anyone else.
Allie, that's the most consistent framework I can put around it, the idea of hemispheric security, because in every other way, the U.S.'s big security strength globally are our alliances. Apparently not the case in the Western Hemisphere.
Okay, so pull on the Arctic security thread. How insecure is the Arctic?
It's a fascinating question because it's been changing for years. Hallie, I did a story 20 years ago almost about the changing nature of the Arctic threat because of climate change and the fact that the sea ice that used to be there.
Oh
yeah,
my God.
it's true.
Please,
it's true.
producers are on that, but you're going to regret ever mentioning it.
I wasn't in it. Yeah, that's fine. As a young producer with correspondent Jim Maceda, we did a series of stories about changing global threats because of climate change. And one of the tops is at the top of the world, where melting ice has changed the navigability of the entire kind of northern end of the world. And oh, by the way, there's a lot of stuff under that ice that people want. Critical minerals, oil and gas.
Yeah.
It's a major new theater, essentially, globally. The U.S. has access to it through Alaska. Russia has significant access to it. The Chinese want to be a player.
it is a dynamic situation, and one that 20 years from now could be even more dynamic. So the idea that the U.S. and partner countries need to take a bigger stake in Arctic security isn't totally outlandish. But the way that the U.S. has addressed that for decades now has been through those partners, the Canadians, the Norwegians, the Danes. And so what we're seeing here is a major shift in the manner in which we're addressing a problem that is changing, ironically, through climate change, something that this administration has long downplayed.
And oh, by the way, the president is also now, according to NBC News reporting, putting his eyes on Canada when it comes to all things Arctic.
That's right, under the same general theory here, that if you want to defend the Arctic, it should be the U.S. defending it, despite the fact that the Canadians have one of our deepest security partnerships and have far more Arctic exposure than does the U.S.
Garrett Haig, live for us here on the White House North Lawn. Garrett, thank you. Let me bring in Brian Chung now. Brian, to the point that Garrett and I were just talking about, you've got the Europeans, you've got the Danes saying, hey, we're gonna do the things you want. Let's talk about this. We can get to a place where you have the security, Mr. President, that you want, without you having to take or own or buy Greenland, which, as you heard,
see you on the next one.
Is not for sale. Now the president threatens